On today's show, we break down the Jake Guentzel trade return. We look at what Pittsburgh is getting in return in the three prospects they got and break down those prospects' games on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hattie Kalakash, joined by Sebastian High, and on today's show, we'll be breaking down the return for Jake Guentzel that the Pittsburgh Penguins got in the trade with the Carolina Hurricanes. We'll talk first and foremost about our thoughts on the trade. We'll also talk about who Pittsburgh is getting in return here in the three prospects that they got, and we'll project all three prospects and kind of see where they fit within Pittsburgh's prospect pool. Before we get into any of that, though, today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code Locked On NHL to get up to $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply, but see Sleeper's terms of use for details. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. So let's get things started right here with the official trade. Talk me through the exact trade and the modalities for each team here.
For sure. So, the Carolina Hurricanes have acquired forward Jake Guentzel, not sure if you know the name, as well as defenseman Ty Smith from Pittsburgh in exchange for a lot of different pieces, including Michael Bunting, forward prospect Vasili Ponomarev, Ville Koivunen, and Cruz Lucius, as well as a conditional first-round pick in 2024, which becomes Philadelphia's second-round draft selection in this draft if the Hurricanes do not reach the Stanley Cup Finals, as well as a conditional fifth-round draft pick in 2024, which I believe is conditional on Carolina winning the Cup this season. So
That's right.
that is the trade as a whole. A lot of pieces going towards Pittsburgh in this deal, and perhaps a slight focus on bolstering the prospect pool in terms of quantity over super high-end quality in this return. Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is a trade that really increases the amount of individual pieces that the Pittsburgh Penguins have to work with. And overall, I think that this is a decent but slightly underwhelming return for Pittsburgh. I like the trade personally for Pittsburgh. It's exactly what they kind of needed. They needed to have an influx of individual kind of assets that they can work with, and that's definitely what they did here. But the part of this that kind of seems a bit underwhelming is the lack of one of the bona fide prospects in Carolina's pool, one of their bona fide top three, top four prospects. I'm a big fan of Ville Koivunen. I'm a big fan of Cruz Lucius, and we'll break down their games more in detail in our second and third segments. But just to kind of sum it up, Carolina didn't really have to give up any of Bradley Nadeau, especially not Alexander Nikishin, who's probably a do not trade on their list. He's probably not available at all to any teams because he's doing really good in the KHL. Bradley Nadeau was their first round pick last year, and he's one of my favorite prospects. I would have loved to see him in this trade. There were a couple other guys that I think we both think could have been decent options instead of Koivunen and Lucius that would make this trade a bit better than it could have been, right? What are some of those names?
Yeah, for sure. So, obviously Brad Nadeau is the big one that I personally would have targeted if I had been the Pittsburgh Penguins. I don't think I would have made this deal with Carolina if Nadeau were not a part of the return. Brad Nadeau was Carolina's first-round draft pick from last year. He went 30th overall, and he has been lighting up the NCAA as a freshman.
Yeah.
He was playing in the BCHL with Penticton last season and lit it up. And then, along with his brother Josh, made the transfer to the University of Maine in the NCAA this year, which is not the strongest program in the NCAA or in the strongest conference of NCAA hockey. However, Brad Nadeau has logged 17 goals and 40 points through 33 games as a freshman, and he is also quite young for his draft class. He has not even turned 19 years old just yet. He's a 5'10", 172-pound winger and center. He's a right shot with super high-end IQ, ridiculous shot, like one of the best shooting mechanics that we've seen in the last couple drafts. Really solid playmaker, really versatile in the offensive zone, and projects as a dynamic force in Carolina's forward core moving forward. But Pittsburgh was not able to land him, and they were not able to land Jackson Blake, who's another dynamic undersized forward. They were not able to land another one along the same lines. Like, Carolina loves their dynamic undersized forwards. Like, there's other guys like Jaden Perron, for instance, that I think could have been an interesting target. If you're going for like the European side of things, I think Alexander Rykov would have been perhaps a bit more interesting to me than Vasili Ponomarev. But yeah, they got some good prospects though. Like we don't have to delve into Carolina's prospect pool here to see all the other players that they've been hoarding, because they draft so well, and they just constantly have an influx of talent, which allows them to make trades like this one. I think I personally, if I'd been Pittsburgh, I would have wanted to add at least one extra defensive prospect. Their defensive prospect pool, especially on the right side, is very weak. I think Scott Morrow would have been definitely one of my targets. Like Scott Morrow and Bradley Nadeau would have been the two guys that I would have been really gunning for, and they weren't quite able to land them. That said, we do not want to skip over the value that they did get in return. We'll really delve into that in the second segment, so wait up. But the Carolina Hurricanes here did very, very well in my eyes. Like, Jake Guentzel is a dynamic goal scorer with real creativity with the puck on his stick, real difference maker, especially in the playoffs. Like, he has so much of a history of producing at a high rate, especially in that 2017-2018 like 12 game playoff run where he had 10 goals and 21 points. Like, he comes to play in the playoffs and always has, which is exactly what the Hurricanes need. So I think that the Canes landed the player that they could really use, and their forward core looks a lot more cohesive in terms of what you need to make a big run at the Cup. And I think he's going to be a tremendous fit in terms of the system, in terms of Carolina's needs of needing to put the puck in the net a little bit more consistently. And they did not give up any of their top 3 or 4 prospects in their pool to do so. So I think it is overall a massive victory for the Hurricanes. And while, yes, they gave up a multitude of assets, they've been hoarding those assets by drafting very, very well over the past 3, 4, 5 drafts, that they have a ton. They have more prospects than they're going to be able to give contracts to, which enables them to make a deal of this sort. And I think that they absolutely hit the ball out of the park on this.
For sure. You mentioned Bradley Nadeau. I think that would have been a really good part of this return, because if I'm trying to look for a player that Bradley Nadeau reminds me of, my brain gravitates to Jake Guentzel. Really good goal scorer with really high hockey IQ, who is slightly undersized but does really well under physical pressure. I think those are definitely parts of Bradley Nadeau's skill set that he would have slotted in really well and made a really good prospect in Pittsburgh's pool. But still, the prospects they got are fairly good. And we'll get into that in the second segment. But yeah, for me, the lack of either one of Bradley Nadeau or Scott Morrow does hold the Pittsburgh grade back for this trade. But again, they got some really good prospects. Now we'll get into them in our second segment here. That's it for the first one. We'll get into Ville Koivunen, Cruz Lucius, and Vasili Ponomarev's games after these messages from our sponsors over at Sleeper.
It's past the halfway point of the NHL season, with the trade deadline now in the rear view, but you can still get in on the action with Sleeper. Sleeper is our #1 choice here at the Locked On NHL Podcast Network for all of your fantasy hockey needs. That's because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. And all you need to do to win that is to correctly predict the outcome of 8 specific player stats. And you can get really creative with that if you like, whether you want to bet on the stars of the league to produce, or perhaps the players that just got moved on deadline day to put up some big points in the playoffs or in the end of the regular season, like Jake Guentzel, for instance. The choice is yours. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details on locational availability.
Alrighty, so moving on to our second segment, we'll be talking about the games in detail and the profiles of the three prospects that the Pittsburgh Penguins got in return for Jake Guentzel. We'll start off with Ville Koivunen. He was drafted in, I believe, the second round of the 2022 NHL draft, and has been doing fairly well
21.
since then. 21, that's right. So yeah, already 2 drafts ago. But yeah, he was one of my favorite prospects in this draft year. I remember having him in my 15 to 25 range, and this year, after last year where it was kind of iffy for him, this year has really proven me right. I mean, he's got what, 17 points in his last 10 games. He's on fire in the last stretch. In the Finnish Liga, which is the top pro league in Finland, which is a difficult league to produce in at such a high level. But Koivunen is doing it through his really good hockey sense, his dynamic stick handling ability, his ability to move in between checks and find space in the offensive zone really well, and his good basis of defensive skills as well. He's making a lot of his offensive plays start in the defensive zone. So that foundation of skills is really interesting, right?
For sure. Koivunen is the gem of this return in my eyes. He's the player that if I'm a Pittsburgh Penguins fan, I'm pretty excited to add into the fold. As you mentioned, he's really capable in terms of two-way game. He's a pretty high motor, very, very good skater. He's constantly using his lateral mobility to create space for himself. Really, really good at creating separation from defenders in transition specifically. Capable playmaker, really intelligent with the puck on his stick, very much possession oriented. He wants to retain possession and slowly build up to create high end scoring chances. He's not your linear winger that just like speeds up the wing and tries to get a shot off from a bad angle. He's really calculated with what he does with the puck on his stick, and I've been a massive fan of him going back to his draft year. I had him ranked 25th overall, which was the lower range for me of where he should have gone. So he really did fall when he ended up going 51st overall to Carolina in my eyes. But he's been on fire this season in Liga. He's been like really taking a big step. So whereas last year with Karpat, he put up 28 points in 52 games, this season he has 55 and 58. And as you mentioned, he's only been heating up with that 17 points in his last 10. And he's been playing like real first line minutes in that last stretch, playing like over 20 minutes a couple times in those last 10 games. And while he did have a short stint in the AHL last season where he just logged a single goal in 12 games, he's a player that I think has real solid middle six upside within the next year or two. I don't think the timeline's particularly long for Koivunen until he can make that move to the NHL and be a relatively impactful piece, and probably tops out as like a dynamic piece on a second line. If we're thinking like conceivable upside, probably not a first liner, especially in the era after Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin, but a really interesting piece to add, and one that I think that Penguins fans are going to be really, 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 really in love with for a long time. Very likable player, and that said, the two other prospects that they added are still quite solid players in their own rights, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can start with Cruz Lucius because I think he's the biggest wild card of the three.
Yeah.
There's a very vast range of possibilities with Lucius. He's an incredibly skillful player. He tries things that other prospects don't think to try. Um, Great stick handler. I love the vision and the playmaking with him as well. His shot's pretty decent, but nothing overwhelmingly good. But what really stands out with Lucius is just how creative and willing to try different things he is. And he's been just carrying Wisconsin in the NCAA right now, production wise and overall in terms of offense. That's a team that's struggled over the past couple of years. And some drafted prospects in their system are struggling as well. If you think of Charlie Stramel, but Cruz Lucius is the offensive dynamo on that team. It's very, very clear. Just overall, you just plug him on the power play and he'll make make things work. The issue is there isn't as much translatability in his game right now. He's not a player who necessarily makes plays off the half wall. He's not a player who necessarily pushes play defensively fairly well and kind of identifies his checks there. The effort level is, inconsistent. At times, he looks like one of the most energetic players out of the NCAA, but at other times, he kind of gives up on his back checks early, starts, stops moving his feet, moving backwards, that kind of stuff. So there are some kinks and issues to rule out in his game before he's a true NHL player. But the range of upside is absurd. I mean, he could be a top liner, he could be a middle six scoring winger, or he can kind of top out as your bottom of the lineup player who's going to give you some really great sequences from time to time, but continue with that inconsistency moving forward. And he could also not make the NHL. So the range of possibilities with Lucius is what's really alluring. But I think that if the Penguins made him part of this trade, it's because they see something in him. And I don't blame him for that because again, the offensive skill and creativity is ridiculous. It's a really good part of his game right now in the NCAA. So Ponomarev is also really interesting. He's a player who played 2 games in the NHL this year, scored 2 points with Carolina, and majorly spent the year in the AHL. But I really like the profile. He's a really good two-way center. I love the way that he positions himself defensively, and it's so hard not to like him. He puts so much effort into every shift. He's a player who's constantly pedal to the metal, who's constantly forechecking hard, back checking hard, doing the right things in all 3 zones. And on top of that, his playmaking touch is pretty decent. Like I wouldn't say there's much potential for him to even become a second liner, much less a first liner. But as a bottom six forward, who's going to give you some great minutes and just be beloved by the Penguins fans, I think it's a comfortable spot for him. It's a comfortable upside, and he's kind of the third wheel of the 3 prospects that were picked here by Pittsburgh. But for me, he's still a decent amount of value and a player I have a very hard time not seeing in the NHL, but also have a very hard time seeing him become anything meaningful in terms of a top 6 player, right?
Yeah, like I think I'm perhaps a little bit more optimistic in terms of middle six upside with Ponomarev, specifically because he is a just an absolutely dogged two-way center. Like as you were saying, he's constantly really implicated in board battles and puck battles and giving his all. And the motor on him is what allows the rest of his game to really tick. And there are some really solid offensive tools with him. Like I've liked his ability to get open in like that mid to low slot in the offensive zone. I've liked his ability on puck in the AHL to uh like find space and not panic under physical pressure. The way he translated from the QMJHL to the AHL via the KHL, the VHL, and the MHL, which is just a fascinating trajectory in terms of
Weird,
development.
very weird.
Um,
Yeah,
but as a 19 or 20-year-old playing in the AHL, he had 10 points in 11 games in his first stint, and then right after that, he followed it up with 46 points through 64 games last year, and then this year he's had 29 points in 39 games in the AHL with the Chicago Wolves, and in his last 10 games, he's only logged a single assist. So he was running about a point a game for the longest time this season in the AHL. He's only 21 years old. He does turn 22 in like a week's time, but this is a really intriguing young player that I think that Pens fans are going to really enjoy for a long time. And while, as you mentioned, the upside is a bit more limited than it is with Koivunen and Cruz Lucius, the likelihood of him becoming an impactful bottom sixer is probably the highest of the bunch, and probably on par with Koivunen. Like I have trouble seeing Koivunen be anything less than a solid bottom sixer as well. But look, the Penguins are adding bodies, and they're going to need some bodies to get through this rebuild. And you want to have young players in the fold throughout this process. And I think adding Michael Bunting as well in this trade is decent value. Like he's going to play quite well alongside a Sidney Crosby or an Evgeny Malkin. And of course, Kyle Dubas is already quite familiar with him. There's a lot of interesting pieces in this trade. I just think that the inability to get one of the top end prospects out of Carolina's grasp was a little bit of a loss in these negotiations for Kyle Dubas and the Penguins.
yeah. Yeah, I will say though, I mean, not a lot of teams have the depth of prospects that
Oh
Carolina
God,
has.
no,
Like they have a
no,
long,
by no
long
means.
list of players who are really, really good. Yeah, and that's what makes it so interesting is that they could have had better for sure. But some of these, I mean, these 3 prospects could be 1, 2, and 3 on like a handful of teams. I'm thinking of Tampa and teams like that. Like there are
A
some
very
teams that
select handful.
don't have this
Like,
level of prospect.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But that wraps things up for our second segment. We'll talk about the overall projection for these three and talk about where they fit within Pittsburgh's system among their prospects right after these messages from our sponsors at eBay Motors.
Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and far more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what it is that you are looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, which is available to US customers only, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply.
Alrighty, so closing things off with our final segment here, we'll be talking about the projection for all three of these players, what we'd expect them to be at their best, what the realistic projection is, and then finally we'll talk about the fit within Pittsburgh's system. First, in terms of the play styles, how they fit within what Pittsburgh's looking for, but also the fit in terms of where they land within the rankings for Pittsburgh's prospect pool. So we'll start off with the first part of that. So projection-wise, for Ville Koivunen, I have a really, really hard time not seeing him become a middle six winger. And he could kind of develop on his game further than that. I think the top line upside isn't out of the question yet. There are still some offensive tools that really stand out to me. I like the way that he moves in transition. The decision making in transition is really good as well. For a player who is a good lateral skater but doesn't have that top speed, being able to be so effective in transition is impressive, and it's mainly due to the hockey IQ. Koivunen for me is the smartest of the three, the most intelligent in terms of his ability to anticipate play, to make the right plays, and decide on a play early. I think that's really a good part of his game, and on top of that, he's got the decent skill level to get that done. And for me, the like I said, realistically, very hard time seeing him become anything less than a middle six player. I very much can see the top six upside. I could see him very well be one of the transition drivers and more smarter elements of a second line, or even be a really good complement to a Crosby who's later on in his career on a first line. Like that's a possibility, right?
Yeah, like, it fully is. Like Koivunen, like as we mentioned in the last segment, is the gem of this return, and he's a really interesting player. But I think like with the Penguins, they were working from an interesting place in that they like. According to us back in August, the Penguins had the weakest prospect pool in the entire league. We ranked them 32nd out of 32 NHL teams in terms of prospect depth, and they had a lot of areas where they needed to add prospects. Like they did not really have many prospects that projected as particularly special apart from Braden Yeager and Owen Pickering. Like those are the two only ones that really stand out. Like maybe Joel Blomqvist if you're giving it a stretch, but there's real limitations in what this Penguins prospect pool had. So adding three prospects right here, right now, as well as one decent draft pick in the upcoming draft is a needed bolster to that depth. I do think that adding a right shot defenseman would have been really nice in this return because they lack that specifically. But yeah, I mean, they add a ton of wingers. Like, obviously, like Lucius and Koivunen are not projected as centers at the NHL level. Like, especially Lucius, and Koivunen, like maybe a 10% outside shot at playing down the middle. But at least with Ponomarev,
Yeah.
you're getting a legitimate center who's been playing solid minutes down the middle against good professional competitions in the AHL. But yeah, no, interesting players to have targeted, but. Pittsburgh needed reinforcements throughout their prospect pool, so I would have liked to have seen them get a defenseman in this trade as well, apart from just the three forwards.
Yeah, for sure. I think the main thing for me that stands out is, who of the three, realistically, who of the three could have been interchanged with a Scott Morrow, for example, to make this a bit more equitable, right? Like it would have to be Koivunen. I don't see any other
likely.
possibility.
Or the draft pick. I mean, like, I would've been interested in going after Scott Morrow instead of, like, what's likely going to be a second round pick, if not one of the last picks of the first round. Especially because, like, Philadelphia's been playing some
Yeah.
decent hockey this season, and, almost, like, even with their fire sale, like, they're in contention for a playoff spot, so that second rounder is going to be in, likely that, like, 50 range maybe, but yeah, again, it was a buyer's market. It's very easy for us from an outside perspective to say that they should have targeted this player or that player without having an understanding of the internal valuations that these guys have in these organizations. But I I do have a sense that the lack of adding that one slam dunk asset that has like significant top pairing or top line upside stings a little bit when you're trading away perhaps the most intriguing deadline rental that we've seen in the last 3 years.
Yeah, and also the fact that, for Jake Guentzel is beloved by Penguins fans. He's been Crosby's winger for the longest time, and he's a fantastic player that brings so much to the game beyond just goal scoring. He's so intelligent. He creates really well in transition. He's got defensive value as well. Like, if you're trading a player that important, but also a player that fits this well with Carolina's system, I mean, I feel like he was made in a lab exactly for Carolina's system. If you're giving them a player like this, you have leverage. You have a bit more to work with. You know what I mean? So that's what's really interesting with this return. But to kind of get back to the fit within the Pittsburgh Penguins prospect pool, for me, they're 3, 4, and 5. Behind Jaeger and Pickering. And even then, I'd say Koivunen
Fully
and
agree.
Pickering are in contention, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd probably put Koivunen over Pickering. Even Pickering and Cruz Lucius would be a slight argument to be made there for me. Again, top like adding like top 3 level prospects is a lot easier when you have Pittsburgh's depth of prospects in your pool compared to like Carolina's, for instance.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
no, like they're adding some really solid players here, and I think that there may have been an immediate reaction from Penguins fans of like, who are these players that I've never heard of in my life that seem good but not like extraordinary? That's also kind
Mhm.
of what Pittsburgh's been needing though, right? Like they're not going to be able to build around Crosby and Malkin for the next 10, 20 years. So they're going to have better B tier players. They're going to have better complementary pieces. And they added 3 very intriguing complementary pieces in this trade that have decent shots at being impactful NHLers, all 3 of them. So I think that they did relatively well, especially when we're comparing it to like yesterday's episode, for instance, with the Thomas Hurdle trade. I think that Pittsburgh did significantly better than San Jose did in trading a high value forward, also around like the same age bracket there with very different contract situations. But yeah, like I think if we're looking at at trade grades here, I would be thinking maybe a B for Pittsburgh. I think they're getting some solid players here, some players that fans are going to really, really like for a long time. I think that tracking Cruz Lucius's development is going to be really fun for Penguins fans specifically. And obviously, Ville Koivunen is going to be just around
Yeah.
the corner in terms of being impactful either in the AHL or the NHL. And they're adding smart, skilled, pacey players, which is something that I'm always a big fan of. That said, for Carolina, I think that especially with the depth that they had in prospects, no asset that they lost in this trade is irreplaceable. Like they already have replacements in their pool for all of these pieces, especially because that first rounder is
Yeah.
quite possibly going to be a second rather than the late first. Just really good business for the Carolina Hurricanes. I'd give it at least an A, maybe not quite an A plus, because I think we both agree that hanging on to Ville Koivunen would have been very nice, but when you're trading for a player of Jake Guentzel's caliber, you really can't be expecting a more palatable return or cost than this. So I think that Carolina did very, very well, and
Yeah.
that Pittsburgh could have gotten a better asset if they'd concentrated on quality over quantity, but they need both in their pool.
Yeah.
So hey, they did what they
Yeah.
did, and I think it's a decent return.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. That wraps things up for today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Again, we're so close to 1,000 subscribers. Be great if you could help us get there. If you're listening, also leave us a comment letting us know what you think of the trade? What do you think of the episode? What do you think of the prospects that Pittsburgh got in return? And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day and leave a rate and review. It takes a second and it helps out a lot. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today to get all your news and updates about what's going on around sports. And make sure to tune in for our next show as we continue our prospect coverage of the trade deadline and of a couple other things. This has been Hattie Kalakash with Sebastian High, and we hope you tune in next time.